Welcome to this La Trobe Asia event, a China Reset. My name is Beck Strading. I'm the Director of La Trobe Asia at La Trobe University, and I would like to start the event tonight by acknowledging the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional elders of the land upon which La Trobe University sits, and I would like to pay my respect to their people past and present, and extend that respect to any Indigenous Australians who might be with us this evening. So it's exciting times if you're interested in Australian politics. We have just seen a new government, the election of a new government for the first time in nearly a decade. And one of the surprising things about the election campaign was the focus on national security and foreign policy, particularly crucial issues of how a government can navigate the fraught relations with China. So Australia and China's relationship has been at a relative low point over the last few years, brought upon by years of antagonistic language, of disputes over trade, concerns over foreign interference, and competition for regional influence. There has also, of course, been a freeze on high-level diplomatic relations, which has been going on for over 2 years now. So the new Labor Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and his team certainly have their work cut out for them in dealing with these challenges. So what we are wanting to discuss tonight is whether we see the new Labor government as trying to reset relations with China. What might a reset look like? Will they seek to shift the public mood on China? And do they even see a reset as being a desirable thing? So I'm delighted to welcome our eminent panel here tonight. First, I would like to welcome His Excellency Mr. Kevin Magee, former ambassador and diplomat and honorary fellow in the Department of Politics, Media and Philosophy at La Trobe University. Great to have you here tonight, Kevin. Our second guest, Dr. Dan Hu, is a research fellow at the Centre for Contemporary Chinese Studies and an ARC Research Fellow at the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. It's always great to have you along, Diane. Welcome.
Thank you for having
us. We have at the end here Professor Nick Bisley, who is the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at La Trobe University, Professor of International Relations, as well as the first Executive Director of La Trobe Asia. Always good to have you along to these events, Nick. And last but certainly not least, we have our wonderful research officer at La Trobe Asia is joining us, Kate Clayton. She's also a graduate student and an academic in the Department of Politics, Media and Philosophy at La Trobe University. Terrific to have you here, Kate. There will be some time towards the end of the session for Q&A. So for those of you in the room, feel free to think about questions as we go along. I'll try and get a sort of survey of questions from the room, but also if you are with us online, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. I can see them from where I'm sitting and I'll hope to get to some of those questions as well. But let's get straight into it. I might start with you, Kevin. Do you think this new Labor government is looking to reset relations with China? And what, if they are, what do you think a reset should look like?
Well, thank you very much. I would say that the government is still finding its way on what it's going to do with regard to relations with China. There's been no immediate start in trying to change the position. And in fact, in terms of the not so much the rhetoric, but in terms of the basic policy, there's been a continuity for the first couple of weeks together with the Morrison government, and a certain wariness about how they're going to deal with China. The question that they'll need to come to is that the other side of the relationship has changed dramatically since the start of the year. The Chinese government has started through its messaging to the Department of Foreign Affairs and its public messaging that it's open to some form of a recalculation or recalibration of the relationship. And this has been formatted or spoken when the new ambassador, Ambassador Xiao Qian, said that China was willing to meet Australia halfway. Because the key question, and the question that people in DFAT are trying to read, is what does mean halfway mean? I mean, that's a threshold question. But certainly, it's different from the two previous years before that, when the Chinese position was very hard line. They weren't willing to give a budge on anything, on any of the actions they'd taken, and they basically took the line that it's all Australia's fault, and Australia has to repair the relationship. I have to honestly say that the Australian side has taken a similar position. It's all the Chinese fault. In fact, Chalmers the other day was saying the starting point is the Chinese have to lift their sanctions on Australia. But what we're in a different situation now. I think the Chinese have now moderated their position and are looking for some form of recalibration. I think reset might be too strong for the relationship. This is particularly important for them as we're heading up to the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations on 21st of December. And that's something that's always very important for the Chinese. They always like to mark these significant anniversaries because it goes back to their whole psyche, their acceptance of the legitimate government of China and various things like that. The only other thing I'd say at the moment is that I think there is a general feeling that the relationship is, and where the policy that we have at the moment is basically a dead-end policy. It really, there's no easy resolution on the policy of where we're heading to at the moment. So any sort of recalibration would need to be on the basis of reciprocity. It would need to be on the basis of diplomacy. And in many ways, that's the key to it. Is the government willing to respond to the Chinese and outreach? The other important thing, which has been important to the Chinese, has been the use of the rhetoric. There's been a lot of inflammatory rhetoric by the previous government, in particular Mr. Dutton and Morrison and some of the others. That plus some of the actions that our government has taken have been seen as by the Chinese as actually sanctions against them. We're looking from the point of view of Huawei and the point of view of investment in various areas like that. So the first thing and the best thing, and I think at least in the 2 weeks we've seen, is that some of the heated rhetoric, the drums of war in China is our competitor or such. I think we're going to see much more moderated language, and that's the beginning point. But in the end, really, if we're going to see any progress, we need to have some sort of agreement that there'll be some concessions on both sides. And concessions are always very difficult because they allow you to say that you're giving away on your principles, you're giving away on your sovereignty. But in simple point, just answering your question, and I could go into greater detail on how that could be done and how the Chinese have indicated that they'd be interested in doing that at a later time. That's where we would go from there.
Well, I might actually press you on that point while we're here, because one of the the discussion points in recalibrating or resetting the debate, whatever you want to call it, is this idea of the rhetoric as being a particular problem. But there hasn't always been great ideas about what else an Australian government might be able to do to recalibrate relations. So I'm wondering if you have views on that.
Well, I mean, when you start talking about the rhetoric in the public, the megaphone diplomacy that we've been carrying out, and a point I didn't make before, and perhaps I should have at that stage, is that if you have a look at our partners in the Quad and our partners in AUKUS, all of them have actually better relations with China than we do. We're the one country, the outlier, that's really in the freezer on that. And again, if you look at with possible exception of some members of the US Congress and such, if you look at our partners, most of them have been much more restrained in the use of their language. So there's actually the rhetoric, the language is important. The other thing that the Chinese want to do, and this is much more difficult for the government to deal with, is that sensitive issues. The Chinese are, and from my own experience, 34 years in DFAT and dealing with the Chinese, you can raise sensitive issues with them, but when you want to, they want to be raised in private. They want to be done in a moderated way. That's more difficult when you're dealing with issues like Xinjiang and Hong Kong and Taiwan. It's not that we haven't done it before. I mean, issues like Falun Gong and Tibet were, for example, we're in major problems in the relationship when the general relationship was better back in the 90s and the 2000s. But at that time, things were done in more private, less of a megaphone type diplomacy. And in addition, there was now defunct, but there was a very effective mechanism from the 90s right through to about 2016, 2017 with the human rights dialogue and with that. And there were programs that were attached to that. So that was a way to raise with the Chinese in effective manners. But the point I was just going to say is, in this era, the era of social media and the era of high understanding of what's going on in Xinjiang, what's happened in Hong Kong, when I talk to my former colleagues, there's some debate on whether that would be feasible now because, the genie's out of the bottle on all of these issues. But that's something that the Chinese would want. But cut the rhetoric, cut the sort of aggressive rhetoric. Secondly, deal with sensitive issues in a more sensitive manner. And thirdly, I think the other thing the Chinese are after, and they quite clearly say, that they have been disadvantaged in their investment decisions that Australia's taken since 2018. Chinese embassy says figures on how much has been missed out. And you've had a situation that started with Huawei, which was quite clearly national security interests. Then it spread things which were contiguous to national security issues. And then they weren't able to invest. And then we got to the stage where you had with among Neo wanted to buy, a Chinese dairy company wanted to buy dairy company in Australia, which was already owned by Japanese drinks company, and that was knocked back. So you have a series of that, and then the rhetoric that's been about the harbour, the port of Darwin, and how that goes. That's been really very negative, and that's had an effect both ways. So investment is down, inward investment, Australia's down to about 30% of what it was before 2018. And in terms of Australian investment in China, according to the ACBC, China Business Council, the last major Australian investment project in China was Cochlear setting up its plant in Sichuan. And since that time, we haven't had any major Australian investments into China then. So it's really cooled that down. And then also the other factor is the people-to-people relationship. So you've had that. So just, if you indulge me for a minute, that's the investment side. The trade side remains very strong, particularly in terms of the commodities, iron ore, various things. There's been some fiddling around on the coal exports, but basically the Chinese are still buying and increasingly buying our commodities, and that side of the trade is holding up. They have sanctions against various areas of Australian exports to China, but they have chosen where they can be replaced. These ones aren't going to damage them. And the final thing I would just point out too, that, the deterioration in the relationship, anecdotally, and also the election result indicates it has been very damaging to Chinese Australians and how they feel about that. And the evidence of that was that in every electorate where there were large numbers of Australian Chinese at the last election, whether they're already held by the Labor Party or by the coalition, there was a large swing against the coalition because they're very unhappy about what they're doing. They worry this is opening the door to potential racism against Chinese. So there's a whole lot of factors, and there's a lot of downsides. The last thing I'd say about trade too is the trade figures also don't reflect the fact that, the loss of opportunity lost, the extra costs. Now you take, for example, according to the ACBC, 90% of the barley, which has been stopped by the Chinese sanctions, has been sold elsewhere. But if you look at the amount of money that the farmers are getting for it, it's lower because they were selling it premium barley, which was used, for human consumption in China. Most of that they're selling in the Middle East and India and elsewhere now is going for animal consumption. They're getting much lower price. So you're having that, and people have had those costs in having to move from your Chinese export market to another. So there were a whole lot of intangible losses that have come from the relationship. So all of that together. And the two other things that the Chinese are concerned about, have indicated, is the disparity in the number of dumping cases. 111 by Australia against China, 3 by China against Australia. And I say that that's a political thing as well. I mean, my former colleagues in DFAT would say, well, all our cases are quite, legitimate from the WTO perspective, but the Chinese don't like that. And finally, on the CPTPP, when the Chinese indicated they're interested in joining that, the reaction of the Australian government was immediate to say no, which upset them because when the Taiwanese earlier said they were interested, we were very neutral on Taiwan. So they see that, also as being an aggressive action against them. So that's where we are, and these are the things that need to be addressed. But on the same token, the Chinese need to address where we are losing out and our market access, our political access. And so it's not all one-sided. I'm just trying to say where the Chinese are coming from. From our side, we need to get the trade sanctions lifted. We need to get the access that we have. For example, for the CHAFTA, China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, for that, for the last, I think 2 or 3 years, there's been no review of that, whereas New Zealand has been able to review its FTA. So there are a whole lot of losses that we named from the Chinese as well. So I would say it would have to be on a reciprocal basis if we're moving forward. But the beginning of all of that is we have to know what they mean by halfway.
And I might bring Diane in here, thinking about what the Chinese government might be looking towards the new Labor government. What would they be wanting to see?
I think the first thing I'd like to say, perhaps, on what Karen just said, is that I may not take it that the Chinese side has moderated its position. What I'm seeing is more like we are seeing that this now that the labor is more. So I want to stress that perhaps the opportunity for recalibration or restart or however you call it might be what we have seen. But I would definitely agree with some of a lot of things we have to really adjust. So if we're going to read what the Chinese government maybe looking to see in the Labor government, I think two authoritative sources that we may look to, one is other is what the foreign minister about China's relations with Australia. I think the key takeaway from Mr. Chan's congressional letter is really that I would call it a gesture, because when you look at the phrasing of it, the exact translation of it is that China would love to work with Australia to reflect on the past and to work towards the future. Like for me, I think that's really quite neutral and quite friendly tone of that, particularly when you compare that with the other things. And then, of course, what is reiterated over there is really the guiding principles for bilateral relations. The one is mutual respect, and of course, then the other is mutual benefit. I think that we can get more really from Wang's comment at the press conference. I think what he tried to summarize about how the bilateral relations have deteriorated to what we are seeing is that he's reading that Australia has sort of negated the pragmatism that was in place for quite a long time in its China policy. So I think what Wang Yi tried to say at that time is really this coming back of the pragmatism, and I would definitely agree with Kevin that the Chinese side would like to see a rational way of doing things, so less megaphone diplomacy, as we said just now, and also things that seem less unnecessarily personal. And I do think that we all have problems with other countries. We all have things that we want to say. I think at the end of the day for Australia, it's really more about the prioritization. What are the things that you want to say? What are things you want to? And that's what Wang wants to say, is that the important thing for both sides right now is to and what is really trying to say is the two sides should seek common ground and just to put aside some of the differences. And I think that would just go back to the rational and also pragmatic approach he was talking about.
having technology issues. But just on that, are you optimistic about a recalibration?
I've long been a known pessimist in Australia-China relations. Since late 2020, when I wrote that piece, Australia-China relations doomed. So a lot of people ask me that question, why is it doomed? What I want to say is that a recalibration or improvement of bilateral relations is certainly desired by both countries. But unfortunately, what I have seen is that it might not be that of a priority for both. So that's what I have seen right now. For example, if we just look at the current circumstances for both China and Australia, like geopolitics, or domestically we look at the economic performance in Australia and China, also we look at the public sentiment. What I'm saying that one is not a top priority for either China or Australia, and instead what I'm saying is really a lot of constraints on both sides. So for that, I would say yes, I'm still pessimistic about it, but optimistically pessimistic.
Optimistically pessimistic. Okay. Well, Nick, I might ask you on your views here. I mean, Labor during the election campaign cleaved very closely to the coalition. I mean, it's often seen or portrayed as being soft on issues of national security. So you can imagine why the Labor campaign elected to do that. But they've also, as noted before, is running with this narrative that it's China that's changed. It's not Australia that's changed. That seems to be something that's quite prominent. But it also strikes me as being a little bit kind of defeatist, like there's nothing that we can really do because of that. So I'm wondering your views on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think they campaigned very much, still sort of they're shell shocked by this idea that they believe they are vulnerable on national security. They've internalized that and wanted to square that away as a potential vulnerability during the campaign. So you saw that positioning. So the question is, what are they going to do in office, and are they going to feel that that's still a vulnerability? And you can guarantee that any softening of the language, any public move to find some sort of middle ground of the kind that Kevin's describing would be pounced on by Dutton, one would think, to say, you saw Peter Harcher's op-ed today, in which it's like China wants the full kowtow, and it's like, yeah, great, this is not the way forward. But that's the kind of language they'll be met with. So the question, like, how vulnerable are they going to feel? How confident are they going to feel? And I think Diane's right to say that in the scheme of priorities for the government, this complex big thing is probably not at the top of the pile, even though it probably should be, in the sense that I think if you step back from it, as Kevin was pointing out, the fact that Australia has probably the worst relationship with the PRC of any of America and its allies, including Japan, with whom there is a territorial dispute and Division I Grade A historical memory issues, of which there is good reason for both sides to feel pretty aggrieved by what has happened on this front, or India that has fought a war and this sort of stuff. So that they can manage a diplomatic relationship with the world's second most important country, and certainly the region's most important resident power, is something we should be somewhat chastened by. And I think the narrative that they have changed is pretty disingenuous. What's changed, I think, more above all else, I mean, yes, clearly under Xi Jinping, China's become a much more confident, assertive, and at times abrasive power. I think that no one would dispute that, and taken steps and risks that you previously would not have imagined. The reclamation of islands in the South China Sea, you really flew in the face of the kind of cautious international policy that China had pursued up until that point. But Australia chose from 2017 onwards a series of steps to both, in terms of domestic and international policy, to say, we don't like you, China, and to do so very publicly, to do in a kind of hairy-chested, very, language, but a very machismo approach, like we're at the front showing China what's what, and really seeming to kind of enjoy the performance of conservative politicians in the US saying, Australia is showing what's to be done. You're like, actually, I don't think we are showing the way to be done because you don't see anyone else following us. You know, China hawks around the world, but will clap their hands, but sensible statecraft has not gone down the same path we have. So that, you know, the choice of how you respond to a PRC that's behaving in ways with which you are not comfortable and not happy doesn't have to be the full, you know, box and dice that we have chosen to undertake. The problem I think that we've got, that both Kevin and Diane have alluded to, is the steps that we've taken make walking some of that back extremely difficult for either domestic political reasons, or because the sort of finding that middle ground and building on it, given the way in which the relationship has been caught up, and particularly the way in which everything has been cast, and not just in this country, but out of the US and others, in very black and white terms, so that conflicts of interest between Australia and China and other countries are framed in very messianic, black and white, good versus evil tones, so that if you even begin to say, well, maybe we should find some way of dealing with diplomatically, having a functional diplomatic relationship with China, it's the Xinjiang, Hong Kong, you know, the long litany of abuse, and not abuse, of very real concerns we have with the PRC. But no one raises the same issues if you talk about improving trade access to Saudi or Iran, or, you know, the long line of dictatorships with whom we are happy to do business. So we can show a sophisticated kind of capacity to compartmentalize relationships with lots of others, but not China. But it makes unpicking this really, really difficult. And I think that the final point I'd emphasize is the need to do things quietly and behind closed doors, because that's how any improvement in the relationship has to begin, which is the quiet stuff of unglamorous, not winning any prizes from the Jackson Society or in the US, but beginning to build some common ground and play a long game. This has got to be something where, and it doesn't mean, you know, building a better diplomatic relationship, trading relationship with China doesn't mean selling, you know, human rights down the river. I mean, you can do these things at the same time, and I think that's, we are as a country and as a region, I think, going down the wrong path, and everything just has to be an either or.
I did catch in the corner of my eye before a comment in the chat online from Andrew. Hi, Andrew. Glad that you're tuning in here about why are we talking about a reset? And I think that it's a good question, and it's one. There was an op-ed written in the Sydney Morning Herald last week by the new head of ASPI, basically saying that Australia has already reset its relationship with China. It happened in 2017, and these are the sorts of strong rhetoric and policy initiatives designed to counter the China threat, and that is the reset, according to that perspective. So the question we pose tonight about a potential reset, I mean, is this redundant? Is this a question that is naive or missing the point?
Absurd that a country like Australia has a non-functioning diplomatic relationship with the world's second most important country. It's just nuts. That we have no capacity at almost any level of government to interact with the PRC in any meaningful sense, let alone shape their interests, improve economic relationships, improve people-to-people relations, build trust between universities. I mean, the list goes on and on. You can do all of that. In fact, we need to do all of that if we want to advance the cause of whether it's human rights, democratization, climate change. I mean, again, the long list. But the idea that we sit there and go, we showed them, and that's the only way we can do things, is to say you can't invest in here, and the universities can't be trusted, and businesses can't be trusted, and probably every second Chinese student is a spy, and is, you know, this is, as Kim said, completely redundant way of managing relationships. You can do these things at the same time. We need to figure out how we have a relationship with the PRC that looks, and this is going to sound weird, that looks and sounds more like Japan's relationship with the PRC than ours.
I might get your view on that a little bit later, Kevin, but I really wanted to bring Kate into the conversation, because one of the big sort of election campaign issues was also relations with Pacific Island countries. So how do you think a new government is going to handle the issue of China's rising influence in that part of the world, which Australia has tended to view as its own sort of strategic backyard?
I think what we've seen at the moment is that it's easy for Australia to be the biggest aid donor in the region. We've done that for decades now, but I think what's harder for Australia is to be the partner of choice. And the past 6 months have really exposed that Australia is in fact not always the partner of choice in the Pacific. And that's, I think, where the new government is going to need to start to work a bit harder. We've seen Penny visit the Pacific, to Fiji, to the Solomon Islands, and I think that's a really good step forward. But essentially at the moment, it's all declaratory policy. We need to see actual policy changes, whether that's, a step up 2.0 or a different type of things. I think Australia and the Labor government need to work hard at having these better two-way exchanges of relations and collaboration. A good example is the Pacific Oz TV program, which is Australia funds Australian television shows to go to the Pacific. Those shows include Better Homes and Gardens, which is quite a terrible example. Here's all about great gardens whilst you're struggling with climate change. And then another one is border security, which is known for having immigrants, turned away at the border, and as well as intercepting Labor migrants in the Pacific. So these are the images that we're showing Australia through the Pacific, and it doesn't invest in any local content. The Pacific has awesome content coming, and I think increasing this two-way type of trade, this two-way collaboration, and really listening to Pacific leaders, if the past few weeks have shown us anything, is that Pacific agency is going to be key here. And that agency is essentially dependent on climate change. They, at the moment shelves that agreement with China because the commitments on climate change weren't strong enough. I think Australia is going to have to match its, the Bidenification of Australian foreign policy by centering climate change. We're seeing these fantastic PR images of the government, but we need to see actual movement on climate change for the Pacific Island, and I think the Indo-Pacific region more broadly, to take us seriously as a new actor and as a kind of key state in the region.
Yeah, I think the new government, it's only been a week, but they've done quite a bit on the foreign policy front. The Quad meeting, Foreign Minister Wong, a couple of trips now to the Pacific, and of course the new Prime Minister's been in Indonesia. But I wanted to ask you about the issues to do with Australia's enthusiastic support for minilaterals, these sorts of informal coalitions among states in the region that tend to sort of, they're small and they don't actually include sort of all of the states in particular regions. In particular, the Quad and AUKUS, the Labor government said that it would, continue to support these minilateral initiatives. Are these really essential about trying to counter China's rising influence? And do you see a new government as really continuing to back the Quad and AUKUS?
I think they are about counting China's influence, but not necessarily in a way that uses hard traditional sense of security and background and counterbalancing. I think what we're seeing is them use, particularly in the Quad, these non-traditional security issues as a way to balance China and kind of perhaps fill in the gaps where Australia's own strategic and defence skills don't match the rest of the region. So the Quad, for example, at the most recent meeting, has this fantastic program, and it's using satellite imagery to track maritime issues. So that could be for fishing, for piracy, climate change, natural disasters, all of those sorts of things. And I think that's the real use of these minilaterals, is these real targeted, well-rounded responses. Whether or not any of the things the Quad said actually happen, that's what we need to push the government to do. I think minilaterals make it a little bit easier for states to do things. They meet more regularly. It's only 4 people. Surely they can work it out logistically. But I think we need to start pushing these states. And Labor have emphasised, I think more than Liberal, how keen they are for the Quad and for AUKUS as well. They have this new Quad research and development program, which they're really keen to kick off as well. Their enthusiasm for the Quad, and the Quad is again, I think, been a bit re-energised. It's re-emphasised and upped its climate commitments now that it's not been stalled by Morrison on that one. So I think we're likely to see a more expanded AUKUS as well as the Quad under the Albanese government. Labor traditionally liked doing multilaterals. We saw that with Kevin Rudd, we saw that with Keating as well. So I think we're going to see both of those re-energized quite a bit. And I think Albanese talking to Boris Johnson, one of his first calls on the way to the Quad, really shows the balance in between AUKUS and the Quad and how important that they are to Australia's foreign policy.
before we get to Q&A, I just wanted to get your response, Kevin. I know that we had a brief conversation over email about the Sydney Morning Herald op-ed, and you intimated that you might have your own opinions about that article. So I'm wondering, what's your view on that kind of idea that that Australia has in fact already reset its relations with China?
I'll say two things about it. I mean, if it was a reset, it was a very gradual reset, because basically what has happened in China policy, very simply put, over a period of time, is that it's become the various factors that are input into it, the national security agencies, the national security concerns, have made it increasingly lopsided towards those concerns, and that's had a flow-on effect through all of the relationship. If you go back and you have a look at the foreign policy white paper of 2017, and what basically, simply what it says about China is that we engage and we hedge. So it's trying to strike a balance, and that balance has never been accepted fully by the Hawks. They've always wanted to say that the hedging or the negative side of things is most important. And so there was a series of decisions that you can see that where the policy changed. I mean, first up was the Chung Kong decision, which is when Chung Kong from Hong Kong wanted to buy the gas assets. And that was quite surprisingly, when that was refused by FIRB, then you had the Huawei, and that seen the Huawei decision, and that then, as I mentioned before, the investment decision. So you could see that national security was overwhelming investment interests, economic interests, and diplomatic interests as time goes by, and it became dominant. So in a sense, that was, not a reset per se, but what it was, a changing of attitude within the government over a period of time. At one time, we were actually quite strong supporters of the BRI. It's probably known that Minister Trobe, when he was trade minister, signed an agreement with the Chinese on BRI cooperation in third markets. So that's on the Belt and Road we moved. So there's a gradual movement across, rather than, say it was a reset and it was the right thing to do is wrong. It was a gradual process, and this has led us into a position where there's no way forward. It's a dead end type of situation in the relationship. If you want to break it, we have to find some sort of common ground. And the second thing I'd say is that for those who say that it's all China's fault, China is the only country that's changed. Well, if you take what that article, the new head of ASPI said, it's quite clearly we changed. Yeah. So, and which I think is closer to the truth. Both countries have changed, and it's been a gradual process, in the deterioration of the relationship.
Okay, well, I think we've got some time for questions. So I might start with in the room. So we've got one. I have to hand you the microphone so that the people online can hear you. But if you'd like to. Oh, okay. Great one. We've got a spare one. Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Chris Nyland, Monash Uni. 3, probably 4 years ago, John Mearsheimer came to Australia and he debated Hugh White. I'm sure some of you know of this, and it's on YouTube if you haven't seen it. And the question was, how should Australia respond to China's rise? And Mearsheimer said, I tell you what you should do, and I'll tell you what you will do. Should and will. You should stay with America, and if you don't, no, you should stay with America and you will stay with America. You should and you will. And if you don't, we will hurt you. It is that explicit. We will hurt you. And don't think we won't. If you look at South America, see what we do to so-called allies who buck the trend. So yesterday, Global Times had an article discussing Australia, long editorial. Finishes up, last sentence or so, Australia acts as America's stooge. What was the word? America's goons. Okay? This is not the way, and Australia wants to have trade, and it wants to act as America's goon. It doesn't work like that, full stop. Okay, my question is, why have none of you, not one of you, have talked about how does our relationship with America fit into this? Why have you not fit into this? Why have none of you mentioned it? Full stop.
Okay, that's one question. So about the US relationship, particularly in relation to China. Other, yep. Over here, Matt.
My question's mostly for Kevin. You mentioned the human rights dialogue that stopped in about 2016 earlier. A criticism I've heard of that was that there was a way for China to be able to frame it as both countries coming together to learn about human rights from each other while not allowing for the sort of united public pressure that like we've seen with Xinjiang. So my question is, do you think that criticism is fair? You mentioned that you thought they were quite valuable. Would you like to see them come back again? Or is there a sort of midway between the sort of megaphone condemnation and the sort of closed door bilateral dialogues?
I'll take one more question. I think James has one in the corner, and then I'll ask our panel for a response to the issues raised. But James?
Yeah, I wonder if I could get the thoughts of the panelists on the issue of values, put values really at the center. Hugh Waite quite famously said once that Australian values were quite vague and certainly altered or were in the process of altering. I think he's certainly right about altering. I mean, we now have about 20% of Australians who have non-European heritage. We probably now have the most diverse parliament in the history of Australia. But at the same time, we also know that China's values have changed under Xi Jinping, becoming more repressive domestically, more assertive internationally, more authoritarian. You know, so are our values diverging? Is there any way you could ever envision them converging? That's certainly what we thought was going to happen in the 1980s and 90s under Deng Xiaoping. Or do we have to set values aside if we really want to repair the relationship, as I sincerely want to do as well? How do we get around that really tricky issue of values?
Diane, did you want to start with addressing one or all of those questions?
I just try to address the question. So the first one about thank you for your comments. That's amazing. But I would definitely suggest that don't read Global Times too much. It's definitely set at one end of the media spectrum in China. Yeah, but the thing is, I mean, I was talking this to correspondents from the Australian, also ABC, and also Sydney Herald, Australian Financial Review. I just said that stop just quoting Global Times. What you are quoting every day is just Global Times. And I think the Australians very easily will have the impression that there's just one media in China, which is definitely not true. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, just a lot of people just read Global Times to get a perspective. But sometimes Global Times can be wrong. So yeah, so that's the first thing. About the US question, I think at least for the Chinese side, the US is always there. I think that has always been the realization, has always been the assumption. In fact, because I work on Australian studies back in China, so actually one of the things that we have been trying really hard to do during the past 5 to 6 years is to try to bring a more nuanced understanding, more comprehensive understanding of Australia, rather than, because the traditional narrative has pretty much been reading everything Australia does against its alliance with the US. So what we are trying to do, for example, the shift, you call it a reset or whatever, since 2017, a lot of it really have reasons inside Australia rather than it's just its external relations with the US. So I mean, I chose not to talk about it. Partly because I don't think Australia has any other option in that one. So I would treat it as pretty much our fixed way of that. As for the third question about the values, I think this is definitely I think this might be one of the challenges for Australia's China policy in the years to come, is that they need to figure something out. That is it just geostrategic, or is it ideological, or is it both? From what I can see, if it's ideological, then there isn't much room for improvement, really, because very clearly we're in a Cold War right now. But then if it's geostrategic, I think somehow Australia can definitely find a way, at least to a certain extent, to find a certain way to navigate the relationship out of the current law.
Thank you. Kevin, your response to
Sure.
this question.
All three. Firstly, to the gentleman from Monash University, you've probably heard that I did say that the security policies become lopsided, and sorry, that foreign China policies become lopsided because of security interests. And that's driven by the people in our security establishment who have very close relations through Five Eyes with the United States and elsewhere. So it's not a matter that the president or the Secretary of Defense in Washington rings or picks up and says, you do this and this. It's more like osmosis. It's through the contact through defense, the contact through the State Department, contact that what's expected from the United States. So, without actually naming the US, I did say that it was particularly lopsided because of that security influence. But it's indirect. It's not really direct per se. And it's decisions taken by Australians influenced by what their view, which is a view which is very much influenced by the United States view of the world. On the second question on the human rights dialogue, the human rights dialogue, the reason I would advocate it is, again, because it is the only proven way that you can deal with these issues and talk to the Chinese in a structured way, and so that they will accept what you're saying, they'll be aware of what you're saying, and perhaps you could have some sort of influence. It's difficult to know exactly how much, but I've got a little person. In 1991, when I was a very young diplomat in Beijing, I participated in the very first human rights visit by parliamentarians and such, and eventually from that grew the human rights dialogue in the later 90s and right through there. So it was an effective way, and it allowed us to talk to the Chinese, to register what our concerns were, without them reacting in a way that would damage the relationship or refusing to talk to us. So you have a situation now where if we want to raise human rights or anything, the only way we can do it is through megaphone diplomacy or through the Human Rights Council in Geneva. So I see some value in doing it, but I did put a rider on, and I've been discussing this with some of my former colleagues, nowadays, because the human rights question, what's happening in Xinjiang and what's happened in Hong Kong has become so prominent. Is it tenable, to be able to quarantine human rights into that mechanism? That's something you have to wait and see. The jury's still out on that. But in itself, when it did work. It allowed us to raise things. And I attended some of these, and back in those days, the main concerns were Falun Gong and Tibet. Xinjiang hadn't become an issue back then, but we were able to raise these and raise cases and get the lists back from the Chinese. And you had some sort. And then there were the technical programs that were assisted with that to try and help develop, respect for the law, women's rights, various things like that. So it was, in some balance, it had some negatives, but on the balance, I thought it was a positive overall. On the last question, a question of values. Well, so let's be frank. Values are important, and they're important on rhetoric and various things. But in the end, it's really deals with interest. And I'll just tell you something personal. From 2008 to 2011, I was Australian ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has appalling human rights records. Well, we were soft, but we went soft on human rights with them because of trade interests, but also because of strategic interests. Saudi vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis Iraq, and the various issues like that. So when you look at that, and when you look at values, and I know this is not exactly the question you asked, James, but when you look at the values in Australian politics, values are useful when they're useful, but in the end, interests are really what matters.
Thank you. Kate, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'm going to take a stab at the US question. I think Mearsheimer classically views things through a very Americanized lens. He's going to see Australia as the kind of little brother of the US. And I think that's true to a certain point, but I think it's also important to recognize that the US looks to Australia in a lot of places as well. We look at the Pacific. Historically, the US has looked to Australia as a kind of sphere of influence, looking for guidance on policy tools because we have closer relations with the Pacific throughout history. And I think as well, what we've seen with Albanese is almost a strengthening of the US alliance. He really embedded it in his foreign policy discussions during the election period, more so than Albanese. So I think we're going to see, I guess, renewed excitement for the US alliance. Biden seemed really excited about Albanese being elected. You could see the fantastic photos of them together shaking hands, and I think because they align so well on issues like climate change, which has become the hallmark of the Biden foreign policy. And I think again, the excitement for the Quad, the excitement for AUKUS is really showing that Australia is always going to be really close to the United States. But I think in regards to this conversation, sometimes it's nice to talk about Australian foreign policy without the US. Often I think they can be lumped in together. So I think it's good to have a discussion about Australia and China, Australia and the region, just about Australia, and not necessarily look into other greater powers in the region.
And quick footnote to that, if you ever talk to Turnbull officials about the decision to block Huawei and ZTE, they will blow up in the face about how proud they were and how the Americans had nothing to do with it, and that we did it first and we got in there early on, just as a kind of bit of color. But there's that. But I think that there is a larger kind of structural point, which is, Australia is very, we have made a long-term significant investment in the strategic relationship with the United States, which if we were to try to move away from it, and just as a thought exercise it's worth thinking through, would be a massive, massive change in how this country does security and defense and intelligence. And I think, if you were gaming out what Australia could do in a region transition, and you put that one on the table and thought it through, you could do it. But boy, it would be a monstrous set of changes. And I think that has very sort of soporific effect in the thinking around what you can do, because you look at it and go, that's kind of off the table because it's just going to cost too much. We would need to triple defense expenditure. We need to do all these sort of things, or begin to do foreign and defense policy in completely different ways. And I think related to that, I'd just underline the domestic electoral point, which is the left of the ALP maybe, and in fact, in some cases, openly skeptical of the alliance, would like to kind of move a long distance from it, but they are scarred by 2004, which is the Latham experiment with this, and felt that this was, if you put that view out in public, you're just going to get completely dumped on electorally speaking. So they feel very vulnerable, and the right of the ALP are true believers in the alliance. That there is a genuine kind of ideological affinity between that side of the ALP and what the US alliance stands for. So it makes navigating that path fairly difficult. And equally, I think if you look at the shift in the Australian approach to China, as Kevin described, it's an incremental thing. It wasn't a grand strategy sat down and mapped out from Turnbull's office. It ebbed over time. But when did it begin? It began in 2017. Yeah. They would not have done this under Obama. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. The only pre-Obama period decision is the Ausgrid decision, which itself was a little unusual, and was a bit of an outlier. So I think there's something on that. Jim's question on the values thing, it's the 64 billion RMB question, really. And I think, but I think Jim's put his finger on a bigger issue in the region, which is Asia has always been known as a place of a very wide diversity of values, ethnicities, religions, cultures, that sort of thing. But there is a big and clear line's probably not the right way of thinking of, between a kind of more liberal and a less liberal part of Asia. And I think one of the mistakes that we have made, and we're part of it, is to securitize that distinction, or just securitize the line between liberal and illiberal. And certainly if you're like me and think liberal values are a really positive thing, we want to advocate them, we want them to be at the center of how we operate as a country, securitizing them in our relationships with other countries is not a good way of doing that. In fact, it's in many ways counterproductive to it. So you see a lot of people write, I think Kate's written a piece on saying, you know, the securitizing the China relationship in the South Pacific is playing into China's hands. And so that I think that trying to unpick all of that, as Diane said, to try to take their values differences, which are very real, and we need to put them on the table and recognize that, but to try to decouple them to some degree from the geopolitical and the interest-based things, and to talk about them in slightly separate ways, I think is the only way we're going to manage this, because otherwise you end up in this highly black and white. Every little step is you know, every little move you make to the other side is a march to hell, because if you've sold everything up the river, and it's unrealistic.
I'm just going to try and squeeze in one combined question from online, including from our La Trobe PhD student, David, who's going to take the opportunity to grill one of his supervisors on the panel here about what can the Australian government feasibly do in terms of resetting the China policy beyond just rhetoric. And there's a couple of other questions that I wouldn't mind just sort of condensing here. The first one is about trust. How can Australian government trust the Chinese government when it has a tendency to say things and then do the opposite of what it says in South China Sea, for example? And the third part is, or the third question is about the role of racism in the relationship as well. So I invite our panel to take whatever part of the questions I just posed there for final comments before we wrap it up, starting with you, Nick.
And don't use the word reset. That's really, really important.
No,
don't. You and do this quietly, build it up over time, find some meaningful middle ground, and begin to build little steps, and work towards building trust. I think politicians lie, stop press. You know, governments say things that are expedient in public because of that will happen. But the move, I think the important thing for Australia to be doing is, saying is starting with quiet stuff, particularly taking opportunity of G20, East Asia Summit, APEC, to do quiet corridor sideline conversations across the levels, but don't instantly we'll grab Li Keqiang's press release and stand there and go, yeah, we're going to do what, that's not going to be a productive way forward. But I think quietly, concrete steps to get Australia back to a position where we are having a functional relationship with the PRC in which we can work on our common interests and also work and talk about the very significant differences that we have. Because at the moment, we're not getting anything done.
Right? Yeah, I think building off what Nick and what you said earlier, Kevin, about being quiet. I think the past few years, our relations with China have been much more declaratory than they have been operational. So I think turning down the language and the politicization, whether that's, no more leaking of 14 grievances or banging on the drums of war. And I think if we keep relations quiet and do things, outside of the newspapers, I think that might also help kind of turn down some of lot of the racist rhetoric that we've been seeing, this politicization of China and Chinese Australians. So I think if we keep things quiet and diplomatic behind the doors, we can still create genuine change, because the newspapers aren't going to create any change. And I think that would also create a potentially better space for Chinese Australians.
Thank you, Kate. Kevin?
Several Chinese officials have been on record saying if Australia wants to treat China as an enemy, it will make it an enemy. So very important from the point of view of space and from the point of view of diplomacy is basically to make clear that China is a partner rather than an enemy, that we may have differences. You can have differences with your partners of whatever type, but if you deal with them civilly, you can deal with that. So that's the basis where you need to start on that. And you also need to secondly, a new mindset within the Australian government that everything is not negative and everything's not bad with China. Things can be done. We can behave like the Japanese or the Indians or the British with regard to China. We don't have to be in a war of words with them or a cold war with them. And as I've been saying before, we need to be able to match their concessions. If they make real concessions, we need to make real concessions and deal with it. And I just finish off by saying, and I'm stealing this line from a colleague of mine, and who said that where the relationship's frozen, and it's a bit like when you take some frozen meat out of the fridge, you take it, well, it takes a while to thaw. So it's going to take some time for this relationship to thaw, unless we can find some sort of diplomatic microwave. Diplomatic microwave. But if we can't find a diplomatic one, it's going to take a while.
We are in the freezer, so.
They are
you
in the
know.
freezer.
Thank you. And finally, last word goes to you, Diane.
Thank you. I think the first thing I want to emphasize is that I know that for a long time, many people in Australia, academics or politicians, have tried to argue that with China, we don't have to choose political relations and economic relations, they can be treated separately. And what I want to say is that, for example, take foreign investment as an example, since 2017 or 18, we have seen it shrunk to really pretty much the pre-2005 level. So that's really what we have seen. And with trade, it has really been boosted by the iron ore prices. So I really want everyone to remember that. The price just really supports it there. But when you look at a lot of the other sectors, a lot of the commodities and services, it's really a very different story. And I just want to emphasize from the Chinese perspective of political trust, and really the Chinese leaders have always been talking about this two-wheel or three-wheel theory, is that political trust and economic relations go hand in hand. In fact, it's really political trust that goes counts first. And I think for the case of Australia, what we really try to say is that the two countries should start building political trust first, but before then we can start talking about economic measures and all those things. So yeah, I think that's really the first thing I want to say. The second one is, like everyone else, let's make it from diplomacy and do more back channeling. And for that, I really have confidence in Labour. Some of the previous Labour leaders are still really very popular in China. So I'm pretty sure that there has been a lot of back channeling over there. But about the last thing, which is the 50th anniversary, I'm not as optimistic as Kevin. I think the Chinese do like anniversaries. We really want it to be, be special. At least there should be an opportunity to reset the relations. But I would like also to emphasize that it's an opportunity, but it doesn't mean we have to. When we look at what happened 5 years ago, the 45th anniversary, that was a great thing. So the Chinese were quite happy when they found that things couldn't be worked out.
Well, thank you to our panelists this evening. I'm sure that you'll agree with me that was a really interesting, fascinating, rich discussion. And thank you to our audience, both in the room and online. Please follow us on Twitter at Trobe Asia if you don't already, and join our mailing list to find more details for events and publications. But thank you again for, especially those in the room, coming out to the city campus on a particularly cold Melbourne evening. So enjoy the rest of your night.